I wonder whether this anti-globalism or this populism will also create some kind of a pushback against internationalization in the academe. I haven't seen any research showing that yet. Maybe it's just a still incipient phenomenon, but it's worth looking at whether, for example, governments that do not believe in this global melting pot liberal philosophy, whether they will also cut funding for their universities that engage in collaboration with the rest of the world, and will they emphasize more domestic development rather than international? And that's really a question worth looking at. I mean, if this phenomenon goes on for a decade or longer, this far right populism, then we'll have to see whether it will also impact this generally very liberal and one world kind of feeling that most universities, especially the globally oriented ones, have. Well, we can continue to feel that way, but what if the financial support dries up? And that goes back to Professor D.K. Srivastava's point about private donors, because it looks like increasingly governments cannot be relied upon to motor along this internationalization. Now, talking of that, last but not least, she'll forgive me, she has waited long. My colleague, Professor Kalyani Unkale, she's just written a new book on this subject, which is about to be published by Palgrave, and we look forward to that. And she also knows a lot about the practical aspects of it, because she heads our international programs office and has dealt with student mobility, joint research, you name it. So over to her for her insights, please.
Thank you, Sriram. In fact, the book released just earlier this week in e-version, and thank you. And the hardcover is still on its way. I'm going to read a short excerpt from the book towards the end of my presentation, but first I just want to come back to the main question: internationalization in research, collaboration or competition? And my answer is competition. Now, ordinarily, competition is supposed to increase the number of options available to the consumer, and in the case of education, to the student or to the researcher. That has not happened in the case of internationalization for reasons that my previous speakers have dealt with quite well. The ascendance of English language and the monopoly of the positivist, scientific, rational, experimental, scientific approach as the only legitimate approach to knowledge creation. So for these two reasons, we have narrowed down the choices available to students than actually, or available within higher education, than actually expand the number of choices available. Remember that the political empires of the 18th and 19th century started with trading and commercial monopolies that were created by European states. And today we have an empire of the mind that has been left behind by this monopoly, which has been created by the English language and a certain approach to knowledge creation. So my answer, though, is also more competition.
Oh.
The solution I would propose is also more competition, but competition based on all the different regions of the world, institutions around the world, understanding their strengths, building on those strengths, and then collaborating in a way that is meaningful and in a way that is mutually respectful, and not everyone going in this drive towards homogenization, right? So with that said, I know I'm the last speaker, so I'm not going to speak very long. My book is called Internationalizing the University, A Spiritual Approach. I'm just going to read a short excerpt from chapter 4, which is called Ilm. And in this chapter, I address alternative possibilities, alternative approaches to creation of knowledge. Glyn Davis, former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, tells the story of King Henry's reign in the 1630s. He recalls that the Protestant king was influenced by the argument of scholars that monasteries were no longer fit for the contemporary times. This led him to support closing down of monasteries on a large scale making the way for the king to maintain oversight on priests and discontinue out-of-date religious practices. Despite being disfavored by scholars, the material and spiritual support that devout local communities drew from them could not be easily ruled out. So the next course was to subject them to an inspection and assessment exercise, followed by extensive publicizing of the breaches and shortcomings found. The clampdown on the monasteries frees up resources, some of which are allocated towards the creation of the modern university. Davis concludes his story on a wistful note. He says, "By selling land that once fed monks and nuns, the crown has acquired much treasure. Some of this windfall Henry spends on new cathedrals, some on endowing university colleges. Most, however, he squanders fighting the fringe." Why is rationality bound up with Enlightenment philosophy and a strictly Western prism of knowing? If application of the concept has brought us to the point of accepting a notion of bounded rationality or context-dependent rationality, can we allow for the possibility that the basis and purpose of rationality can, after all, be reconciled with other philosophical traditions? Thank you.
Thank you, Kalyani, for the preview of the book. Sounds like a really important critical intervention. In fact, all the panelists have been fairly critical and have actually brought out plenty of negatives in the process of what we generally assume is a global good, you know. International collaboration is a global public good, we think. But it seems we have problematized many aspects of it. So let's move to the audience now. I request you to kindly direct questions. We have about 12 minutes. So we are in time, and if you could kindly direct at specific speakers. Professor Holland, first you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Siram, and thank all the panelists for speaking so eloquently on a topic that's extremely important to the future of science. And I wanted to really comment on one development in particular. And this goes to the issue of research collaboration between U.S. scholars and Chinese scholars. As you may know, a number of Chinese faculty members and researchers have been arrested in the United States for stealing secrets and acting as agents for the Chinese government. And if you work at a U.S. university in the research area, one of the laws that you have to be aware of is one that actually restricts access by PhD students to certain types of research funded by the U.S. Department of Defense. And universities can get into big trouble and have to pay big fines if they're not strictly enforcing the law. So this is one of the negative aspects of research, international research collaboration, this fear by the United States and perhaps other countries as well, that scholars from other countries might actually be agents of their governments. And then secondly, that there might be a compromise of national security through the research collaboration process.
Thank you, Professor. Indeed, artificial intelligence is now a kind of a battleground, and nobody wants to concede space. It's seen in a very national prism right now, rather than a collaborative international one. So restrictions apply, and indeed the China-US collaboration, it's interesting still that there are so many American think tanks and endowments that have invested in Chinese universities, but then there are also clear red lines drawn as to with regard to espionage and stealing of secrets. Yes, sir, please.
This is Mujibur Rahman. I just wanted to have select for the conversation on this particular observation that John made, that why is it Hindi that is spoken by so many people, why so little interest in this particular language? In the context of this particular panel discussion, the question is that could it be possible for India to conceive internationalization of education through vernacular languages, or what place vernacular language could play? Will it facilitate or serve as an obstacle? Which obviously takes us to the bigger question that why certain languages kind of have an appeal. What are the factors that contribute to that kind of an appeal? Some of the finest fictions that we have read, say, in Russian language by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and others, how many people read Russian, want to learn Russian language because they have read these great books? Or we can ask the same question with respect to, say, we all read Marcuse, Gabriela Garcia Marcuse, but that does not excite us to learn Spanish, for instance. And so therefore there is a relationship between language and the state power and the wealth generation. There is more interest in German today than French in Europe, precisely because German economy is doing well. So far as Hindi is concerned, Hindi does not have much of an appeal even beyond its own territory within India. Our Home Minister is regretting now after making that statement that it would become national language. In South, there is a major backlash for it. In fact, if in South there is some acceptance of Hindi or appreciation for Hindi, it's more because of my Khan brothers of Bollywood, because of that Bollywood film, than because of anything else. So I think we need to think about it that, of course, there is the risk of death of this language if it is not adequately internationalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rahman. Kavita ji, would you like to respond, please? Yeah.
I again think it's a wrong way of internationalizing by saying that, oh, Hindi now will be for everybody. If you see India, you have borders with Bangladesh, you have Afghanistan, you have down below, you have Sri Lanka. So you have a way of internationalizing in different languages for different parts of India. I know how many Bangladesh students study in Kolkata, for example. So internationalization doesn't mean that you impose one language on the whole country and then try to internationalize that language. It has to be a little more nuanced than that.
Okay, questions? Dr. Alice Prochaska, please.
I just wanted to observe, I sit on the Marshall Commission, which brings American graduate students to Britain. And it reminds me every year at this time of year when the new Marshall scholars arrive, just how true Oscar Wilde's aphorism was about two countries divided by a common language. And I just wanted to enter a cautionary note that it's terribly important that we should be able to educate people in languages that they understand, and that's a huge issue. But we should not make the assumption that a common language, like English, actually fosters international understanding. I don't know what the answer is, but there needs to be a certain amount of caution. Publishing in international journals often leads to mutual incomprehension.
Professor Rajkumar?
All right, thank you so much for the panelists. I want to just ask one major question relating to internationalization because that affects the future of internationalization, particularly students. All forms of internationalization requires enormous financial resources. And every university is struggling with ideas of internationalization because it inevitably favors a few and a large number are simply deprived of. Even slightly privileged universities, such as the ones that we are here, a large number of our students simply may not be able to afford it. So while our objective is to promote internationalization, some reflections and thoughts about how we can do it, which can make internationalization more democratic and inclusive from the conversation that we had from yesterday's session.
Who would like to take it from the panel? Maybe I should ask Manjula ji to respond.
Yeah, so I'll respond to the one on financial resources, and that's a big one because time and again we have a few million worth of scholarships, and we ask ourselves, I mean, physical movement of students. I mean, each scholarship would cost anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000, depending on whether it's a 1 year or 3 years. And so one idea is, do we actually change the shape of these scholarships? Do they just go for a semester rather than a full year or 3 years? Is that one possibility? How do you actually distribute limited resources to maximize? And the answer to that is not clear. Because sometimes we offer just tuition and still we have students struggling to pay maintenance costs, living costs. So there's never, I mean, these are, which is why we constantly try and reinvent or at least reflect on the programs that we offer. The other is, I've said we haven't really exploited everything, and technology is one of them. Could we use technology to have joint teaching? Can people do online courses, bits of courses? I think these are questions that we have to ask, because you will never have enough physical mobility between countries.
That's what I was trying to hint at.
Internationalization is something you talked about.
Yeah. So, I mean, you will have these models coming up. Because, as I said, meta universities, different courses, online courses, modules of courses. And universities will have to learn to collaborate in that model rather than physically sending teachers and students for long periods of time.
And one great example, in fact, I said, government may not be able to do much, but what India has done with the Pan-African e-network, if you study that, it's telemedicine, teleeducation through online means, covering all the African Union member countries. It's more than 50 countries. And I've heard many good stories of people benefiting from it through low-cost teaching and learning across the Indian Ocean. We are vastly separated. African students cannot often afford to come here, and Indian students rarely venture out to Africa. But then through these means, technology can be a bridge. Okay, Professor Marx, sir.
I don't know what you mean by internationalization. It is one-way traffic or two-way traffic. If it is one-way traffic, I think Australia is benefiting quite a lot. If Indian students, Chinese students, students from Sri Lanka, Africa, and so on, don't go to Australia, its economy will be affected. And I tell you, I read every day that the standard of these English of these students is not up to the mark. But these institutions, they do everything to help them. 3 months course, 4 months course. And the students are very interested. Even they pay a lot of money because they think if they have stayed there for 2 years, they will get employment. And there is employment. So they are getting rich, they are getting fat on foreign money. But it's not the other way around.
Right. No, in fact, Manjula ji also mentioned it's unidirectional, largely, the student mobility from south to north. But interesting example, like Bangladesh has now a BRAC university and is attracting large numbers of foreign students. Thanks to the SARC governments, no matter how difficult Kavita ji's job is, end of the day, we are hosting students from all the South Asian countries here in India. It's a matter of great pride for us. So hopefully south-south mobility in education should be going faster. Professor Marx had a question, and then Moshe.
Thank you, Sriram. Gudmundur raised, and you articulated extremely clearly, the challenge for internationalization and research collaboration or competition posed by the rise of nationalist populist regimes and versus the globalist regime that Gudmundur quite rightfully quoted a speech which will go down in history, I'm afraid, that the future does not belong to globalists. I think it's up to us, and it may be in your book. I can't imagine that your book would not address an alternative to encouraging this trend. But I turn the question to you, Sriram. Do we have a responsibility in the universities where we function to be proactive in creating collaborations that will bring together scholars from the very countries where these populist trends are emerging and are challenging the liberal framework of post-World War II internationalism that is represented by the international legal regimes that Gudmundur is referring to? Do we not have a responsibility to develop consciously proactive collaborations to reinforce those who are resisting this trend within the half a dozen countries in particular?
Thank you, Stephen. I'll just give a small example. Time is short. I was in Italy a few months ago after Matteo Salvini took over, and the academics in the University of Bologna were, in high, in a delirious state, because on one hand, the EU funding encourages internationalization and mixing and, bringing in multiple perspectives, broad cosmopolitanism. On the other hand, the Italian government says we're going to start cutting funding for universities that do not promote a strong nationalist perspective. And clearly, for a populist like Matteo Salvini, these two are opposite. The two cannot coexist. So on the important question of research on migration, for example, it's the hot button topic there. The Italian scholars who promote a more liberal view of immigration and open doors are under severe pressure. At least until recently. Now Salvini is out of government, but they're still the most powerful force in Italy. So to answer your question, when Indians, in fact, they were quite interested in the fact that we had more than 20 million immigrants in India who are undocumented or who have come in without any legal papers. They're saying, we would never allow something like that. Our government, it would be anathema. So how are you doing it? So it's quite interesting, right? In many ways, there's a role reversal. There are some countries that still promote openness and multilateralism and liberal values in the global south, but you have quite a few skeptics now in the north. So the scales have been turned. So maybe the onus is on us now to promote a global south variant of universal values, and perhaps we could take that up as a research project. But Moushami had something to say.
Okay, since you mentioned a global south variant of universal values and my colleague Kalyani out there, I'm really looking forward to read your book, particularly chapter 3 that you mentioned. Chapter 3, right? Alternatives. I don't know whether you have this quote in your book or not, and please forgive me for being parochial in quoting from Tagore. University is there to offer us opportunity for working together in a common pursuit of truth, sharing together our common intellectual heritage to enable us to realize that artists in all parts of the world have created forms of beauty, scientists discovered secrets of the material universe, philosophers solved the problems of existence, saints made spiritual truths organic in their lives, not merely for some particular race to which they belonged, but for all mankind. When we understand this truth in a disinterested spirit, it teaches us to respect all the differences in man that are real, yet remain conscious of our oneness, and to know that perfection of unity is not in uniformity, but in harmony. So I just wanted to share this quote
Thank you, Moshe.
and also highlight something Professor Kavita Sharma mentioned in terms of internationalization of at home as a concept, an alternative, especially for to give those opportunities for students who don't have enough resources to themselves travel abroad, but to do things creatively to internationalize the curriculum. Even in many Western countries.
And she meant interstate also. Between states, there hasn't been much mobility in the past in India, within India.
Yeah, within internationalization at home, the new concept that people are talking about.
Great. We are 5 minutes past time. Any last question from the audience? Can a student, are there students interested in knowing something? I would like to bring in younger people into the discussion. Students? Yeah. So, yes, please, yes.
I would just like to bring up a question that was already raised, I think, earlier. In US, for example, specifically, what is general consensus that does the general populist or protectionist mindset of the president or the government in general affect the way the universities function in terms of whether they still encourage international students to come in and take part, or?
Well, I can say that the inbound flow of international students has declined under Trump. That's statistically proven, and the Canadians have made hay while the sun is shining. Yeah, but Justin Trudeau, had the open
And the
door
Brits.
thing. They'll really manage to divert a lot of the North American student traffic to Canada. But I don't know if this is a long-term trend. But because this is also linked not only to nationalism, but also to the immigration opportunity. Because you take what you call a maximum intolerance to immigration. That's what they call it. Then students find it hard, less. Incentivized to study in the U.S. Yes, sir. You
But
had.
to the extent the question was about U.S. universities, they have shown no less interest in global support, and their scholarships and whatever exists are there, and they navigate this same space. It's true that U.S. immigration has made it more difficult, and there's been some high-profile cases, and the numbers are down, but they're down very modestly at this point. That could continue and go much farther if the perspective represented by our president becomes a larger norm.
Yeah, so that's that's the strength of the U.S. academia, because they have multiple pluralistic viewpoints, and it's a fairly strong civil society. So many of them oppose Trump, but that's okay. I mean, that's the contention of forces. But sir, I'm not sure about the statistic, because I read 2018 30% decline in inbound foreign students into the United States, and 28% increase into Canada simultaneously. So
I think
it seemed
only-
like a net replacement.
I think only 1% reduction in US, if I remember right, and the UK 40% increase in the last 2 years, contrary to general perception. And with the post-study work visa announcement, we expect that this will get better. I just want to say one thing about research and collaborations and how agendas are formed, because the power politics between India and UK has clearly changed. And even when we designed UKERI, it was supposed to be for mutual benefit. Both countries decided what money was going to be put. It was jointly designed. So, and today, I mean, Indians negotiate where money is invested bilaterally. So I think things are changing. Maybe it's not very clear to the external world, but it's all for the better.
Now, I want to thank, there's one more student. Can we accommodate him? It's 7 minutes late, but maybe you can go 9 minutes late and finish. You should never say no to students, please.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, the last session we had on day one was about diversity, and it was discussed quite in a local imperative, in the sense that the speakers were talking about how should Indian universities include people from different races, different castes. But my question is that, considering that we are talking about internationalization now, so for Indian universities, does internationalization also figure in their long-term approach of diversity? And if yes, then how do they connect the both?
Ma'am, I request Kavita ji to respond, because she's a champion of Indian, universities, and she can speak best on this.
What precisely are you saying is what I didn't quite get.
Ma'am, the question is internationalization consciously part of our diversity policy or no?
Well, no, not really. Because in the public sector universities, they say 10% will be for foreign students. But that also includes NRIs. But if you take statistics, they aren't filling up those seats. And there aren't people, they're hubs. Pune, Bangalore, Mysore, where people are already there, Mumbai, Delhi, they will go. But what about the others? And that's where I keep saying, the state universities cannot have that policy. If your own jurisdiction is restricted to 10 districts, and you're only getting students from those 10 districts, how will you just plant a person from abroad there? And they have no way mentally, emotionally, psychologically, physical spaces to do that. So diversity is not, in terms of internationalization, is not a part of their horizon.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Thank you, everybody. Wonderful panel. Please give the panelists a round of applause. Thank you. We are taking a short break. We are late by 10 minutes. So we'll have to come back faster.